Thank you all so much for joining us. Welcome to the Washington State University Farmers Network webinar series. This is brought to you by the Washington State Soil Health Initiative. I am your host, Carol McFarland, subbing in today for Dr. Haiying Tao. Our guest for today is Dr. Clain Jones. Hi, Dr. Jones. Welcome to this webinar series. How are you
Carol?
today?
I'm doing pretty good considering everything that's happening nationwide, worldwide, and in Washington and Montana with the virus.
Thank you for being here and sharing your experiences on liming acidic soils in Montana. In your experience, how long can the soil and plants benefit from a one-time lime application?
So that's work that, of course, would take a long time to do. We just started liming in research studies about 2 years ago, so fall of 2017. So we saw results in 2018 and 2019, but really hard right now to extrapolate very far. What we do have, though, is a number of long-term studies where we've measured pH after, say, 8 to 14 years of these studies. So we have a pretty good flavor for how quickly pH drops. And so I want to go over to my presentation to show some graphs that might help give your audience a little bit of a flavor for how quickly pH can drop. So what I'm showing here is two results from two of our studies where we tracked nitrogen input over fairly long studies, an 8-year study on a sandy loam soil, a 14-year study on a silt loam soil, and then we measured soil pH both at the beginning and end of those studies. What we're trying to show here is how quickly pH can drop as nitrogen rate increases. So the major cause of pH drop is nitrogen application. Nitrogen, especially ammonium-based nitrogen, such as UAN, urea, anhydrous, all undergo a process called nitrification, which lowers the pH. So as you can see here, as nitrogen rate goes up, the pH dropped. It was about a linear drop, so for every 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre, the pH dropped 0.04 pH units. That was on a fine textured soil. On a coarser textured soil, we saw a faster drop, as you can probably guess, since coarse textured soils have less buffering capacity. Here, just 500 pounds of nitrogen per acre dropped the pH from about 6.3 down to about 5.3, and we start seeing growth issues below about pH 5.2. So again, even though we have not done a long-term liming study where we can start to estimate how long will lime last, we do know, for example, that if we were to lime to, say, pH 6.2 in a sandy loam soil with low organic matter, that after probably about 500 to 600 pounds of nitrogen per acre, we would probably start running into some pH problems again. On the other end of the spectrum, let's say we were to lime a silt loam soil to a fairly high level, 7.2 or so, it would take thousands and thousands of pounds of nitrogen per acre over time, probably 20, 30, 40 years, before we would end up with a pH that we would consider to be a problem. So hopefully that makes sense, and I'll come back to this graph in a little bit. So you might be asking, well, how much lime does it take to, say, get up to pH 6.2 or 6.5? This is another study that we did using sugarbeet lime, where we applied from no lime up to about 6 tons of lime per acre, and then we measured the top 4 inches soil pH. What this shows is to bring the pH from about 4.5 to, say, about 6, we require about 4 tons of sugarbeet lime per acre, so quite a bit of lime. Then we would expect over time for that pH to basically probably follow a curve that looks a little bit like this, where it slowly drops over time as we apply nitrogen fertilizer. The other thing to notice here is that it takes less lime to bring the pH up from 4.5 to, say, 5.5. It takes more lime to bring it from 5.5 to 6.5. On the Converse end of that is pH drops, we kind of see this acceleration where this is essentially the curve we think we're seeing, that pH starts dropping as it gets close to about 5 or so, it starts to really accelerate. And that's why this problem has crept up on a lot of Montana farmers. This is a results from a study done in the laboratory where we incubated different soils that started at different pH levels to see how much lime we needed to bring the pH up to an arbitrary pH 6 level. So what it shows on the x-axis is the lime rate of calcium carbonate in tons per acre. And this was pure lime. This wasn't sugar beet lime. And then we tracked soil pH as we increased the amount of lime added. We had two soils that had a fairly high pH, 5.4 to 5.7. As you probably could guess, it doesn't take much lime to bring those soils up to pH 6. We then had 6 soils that had more moderately low pHs, somewhere between 4.3 to 4.9 on average. They required about 1.5 tons of lime per acre to get the pH up to 6. And then 2 soils were down in this very low range where we were seeing almost complete crop failure. Notice that here we needed almost 4 tons of lime per acre to get the pH up to 6. So my take-home message here would be the longer you wait to mitigate your soil pH, the more lime that it's going to take, and likely also the more yield loss that you might experience. And so that hopefully attempts to answer your first question there, Carol.
Thank you, Clain. Those looked kind of like buffering capacity curves to me.
Yeah, they essentially are.
So my second question for you today is lime is insoluble. So it takes many years for surface applied lime to reach the acidified layers in our soils where here on the Palouse where we deep band nitrogen in no-till systems. In your opinion, is it necessary to till in lime that it can be more effective? And what would the effect be on soil organic matter?
Right. So those are great questions, and ones that we as researchers and also crop advisors and producers are really wrestling with. For the most part, we know all the advantages of no-till, from residue, from increased water holding capacity, generally increased yields, better aggregation. And so our wish would be that we wouldn't have to lime, but unfortunately, at least based on the literature in Washington and research that we've seen in Montana, is it looks like for a relatively fast response, we probably do have to lime. So this is a study done in Washington State where 1 ton of lime per acre was added on a long-term no-till residue in November. This was sugar beet lime. And then the pH was measured at different depths, both at 6 months after application and 18 months after application. So soil depth on the vertical axis, soil pH on the horizontal axis. The 2 yellow lines, the yellow line and the yellow dotted line, were the control. So no lime was added, and basically it just showed that pH went up a little bit, and pH does fluctuate with the seasons. Even without lime, the pH went up a little bit. The more important lines here, I think, are the blue lines. So this is sugar beet lime, the pH stratification after 6 months. The thing that really catches my eye is that at 1 inch down, 2 inches down, about 3 and 3.5 inches down, the pH was not affected by that 1 ton per acre of lime. So the only place where it looks like it was affected was at 1/2 inch. So as you know from having, probably all of you having dug soils, there's not a lot of roots at 1/2 inch. Most of our root ball is going to be somewhere down in this range, 1.5 to 3.5 inches. And so it looks like at 6 months after application, there wasn't a big or really any change in soil pH. It took a full 18 months before we saw a bump at 1.5 inches, a small bump at 2 inches, and then again at 18 months, the lime had not moved 2.5 inches down in the soil. So if 2.5 to 3.5 inches is where your low pH is, probably you're going to have to wait more than 18 months if you do a surface application of lime. So my answer here, can tilling in lime be avoided? I would say only if really patient. We found pretty similar results here in Montana. So here we had 3 collaborators where they were all no-till farmers. One of the farmers was very concerned that if he tilled, his soil would blow because he had very little residue, partly because of the low pH. He had a coarse textured soil. There wasn't much holding it. And so he did not till his lime in. What I plot here is the year 0 pH stratification. So notice that up near the surface, we had pH somewhere in the mid 4s, a little bit in the high 4s below that, and then increasing to 6, which is a pretty typical profile that we have here in Montana in these acidified soils. Very low near the surface. We've had decades of broadcast application of urea, so most of our pH drop is pretty near the surface. In the no-till field after year 2, we did see a little bump of pH similar to the Washington study at 1 inch down, but notice that at 3 inches down, there was really no advantage of that lime. The pH did not increase at all. Only in the tilled soil did we actually see a nice pH bump at 3 inches down. So my concern here would be that in this no-till soil, we definitely did not see any benefit of the lime. When we took photos, when we looked at the plants, there was no benefit of the lime, whereas in this tilled field, there was benefit of the lime. Down at the bottom, I show the type of tillage that was used. So the farmer used a single pass beaver tail spike and a harrow, not what I would consider overly aggressive, but enough to get lime down to about 3 inches. So a big question I get is, did that one-time tillage destroy soil organic matter? What my colleague Rick Engel has graphed here on the horizontal axis is the soil organic carbon, which is directly related to soil organic matter, pre-tillage in 2017. He did this for 4 different depths. Then he measured soil organic carbon post-tillage in 2018. And what he found was the points fell almost exactly on a 1-to-1 line. So apparently one-time tillage, at least done correctly, not a super aggressive tillage, did not decrease soil organic carbon. We know that if you till 5 times a year, like our predecessors, our ancestors did, my grandfather did in Canada, we know that we will decrease soil organic carbon. But if we do it once, and maybe only have to do it once, say every 10 or 20 years, in the case of lime, we probably are not destroying soil organic carbon.
Thanks for that, Clain. You've got some really good information, both from our local examples for us, as well as where you're at in Montana. Thanks for sharing those.
No problem.
It looks like you're you know what question I'm going to ask based on your slide.
Right.
So all of us understand that pH and acidity is very important, but so is making ends meet and businesses staying solvent. So do you have ideas for practical ways for liming that will show both the agronomic benefits as well as the economic benefits?
Hopefully we do. You know what? I think the big challenge is that lime is fairly expensive. The reason so many of my results are using sugarbeet lime is that's the least expensive lime form in Montana. So it's free at the pickup location at the sugarbeet facility. And then the cost is the shipping of it, which for most of our farmers and what I consider the low pH epicenter is around $35 per ton. I know in Washington State, there's lime available, and I've heard costs anywhere from about $100 per ton for ag lime up to about $200 per ton for prilled lime. So that's, you know, certainly not inexpensive, but I think the goal would be finding the least expensive lime source, which is either probably ag lime or perhaps waste sugarbeet lime. So the big question, though, is does lime work? And I know there's studies in Washington that have shown not very large effects of lime application. Here in Montana, we generally do see benefits. This is just an example of one of our studies where on the left we applied lime, 4 tons of sugar beet lime per acre that was tilled in. On the right, we did no lime. The pH stayed about 4.5. And at least on this pea field, we saw about a 7 bushel per acre bump. So kind of back of the envelope calculations, that's going to pay for itself in not very many years, depending, of course, on the price of pea. Something that I've done, I'm not an economist, but something that I've done kind of again, back of the envelope to try to get a flavor for does lime pay, is we've used data from both our studies as well as Idaho studies to get a flavor for how long might lime increase cumulative grain income. So what I've plotted here is years after liming. Cumulative grain income here, I've used those long-term studies that I've shown, plus the benefit or the increase in pH from liming to see what would happen in 3 different scenarios. So the bottom 2 scenarios are unlimed scenarios, where we started either pH 4.8 or pH 5.2. There's not big differences in grain income down at the low end, but as these studies progressed, we predict that essentially grain income will plateau, because here in Montana, we have complete crop failure when our pH is too low. So in the 4.8 case, you can see that it plateaus earlier, pH 5.2, it plateaus later. And then when we lime to pH 6, it doesn't start to plateau until about 12 or 14 years after liming. So what we want to do is compare these cumulative grain incomes to cost. If we look at how much lime was needed to bring the pH from 5.2 to 6, it's about 2.3 tons. If we look how much it takes to go from pH 4.8 to about 6, it's about 3.2 tons. Those are on the order of $100 per acre cost compared to over a 10 or 15 year period, thousands of dollars of, you can think of it as either gained income or prevented lost income. So from a return on investment, I view this as, somewhere around a 10 or 20 ratio, where the return is quite a bit higher than the cost. And that's, easy for me to say sitting here in my bedroom. I'm not the one buying the lime. I recognize that it's expensive, but I think working with bankers, educating bankers, pointing out that this is really a capital investment. It's not like nitrogen. It's not an annual input cost. This should benefit you for at least a decade, maybe 2 decades, and there should be a very large return on investment.
That looked like a really good breakdown. Thank you for that, Clain. I think that capital investment piece and the return on investment is really key, and it is a little bit different than nitrogen inputs or other fertilizer inputs where you see the benefits immediately.
Right, a lot, really a lot different. There's a few fields where we think probably the producer sees an economic benefit in the first year, meaning where we go from complete crop failure to say 35 bushels of winter wheat per acre. You run the math on that, even at low wheat prices, and that will pay for itself. But for the most part, it's going to be more of a 2 or 3 or 5 year where it begins to really pay for itself.
Yeah, that's a really big piece of the barriers from what we've been hearing from the feedback here.
Sure, especially with like low or negative returns. Right now, it's hard to think of another input cost for sure.
So with that, another tool that we can use, from what I understand, is that there are some cultural practices that we can do to slow the rate of acidification. Would you share your thoughts on that?
Definitely. So I already showed this curve, this graphic, but it really points out how nitrogen rate decreases soil pH. So one cultural practice is really thinking about how to use your nitrogen more efficiently and effectively. The higher the nitrogen rate, likely the faster the pH drop. And so in our country, where hard red wheat is king, it's really hard to think about dropping back on nitrogen, in part because of lower yield and largely because of lower protein. I know in Washington State, where there's a mix of soft whites and hard reds, there are possibly options of selecting crops that need lower nitrogen rates. Also, making sure you use soil nitrate levels to determine your nitrogen. Possibly think about splitting nitrogen, only apply a second dose if the growing season warrants it, meaning it's, say, wet or wetter than normal growing season. So this is a graphic that shows in that long-term study, that 14-year study, how different cropping systems affect soil pH. So this is something that I think in Eastern Washington, you have some options to play with your rotation and see how that might affect soil pH. So what I've plotted here is soil pH in the top 4 inches, ranging from about 6.2 up to 7.2. So certainly not in a range where we have concerns, but it does show that there's certain rotations that do drop the pH faster than others. The numbers here are how much nitrogen per acre was applied over the 14-year study. So starting on the left here, our fallow systems, even though there's lots of non-sustainable issues with fallow, notice they did not drop the pH very much, partly because they don't require very high levels of nitrogen. The wheat on wheat system required a high amount of nitrogen, and that showed the largest pH drop by far. On the other end of the spectrum, a rotation that was pea grown for grain followed by wheat actually had a pH very near the initial pH of 7.4 in this study. So that might be an option. And I know there's a fair amount of pulses grown in Washington State. A pea forage system, so peas that were hayed off actually showed a decent pH drop. We think that's because when you hay off a crop, probably fairly close to the ground, you lose a lot of what's called base cations. Those base cations help to buffer soil pH. Our cover crop system didn't do super great, maybe on par with these fallow systems. And then CRP seems to be a winner as well. So a CRP system that was largely alfalfa with some perennial grasses in it did really not drop the pH much, if at all. So just some options for growers to think about when they're picking crop rotations. Another option would be to think about adding a little more seed placed phosphorus in your system, because we found that seed placed phosphorus can actually have an effect similar to lime. So here on the left, I've plotted the pounds of P2O5 per acre, ranging from 0 up to about 90 pounds per acre, so very high rates. And we've plotted durum grain yield on the vertical axis. The top green line, this flat line, shows that regardless of the phosphorus rate, the durum yield was 46 bushels per acre when we applied 5 tons of lime per acre, which brought the pH up to about 6. When we didn't add lime, though, notice there was a really large increase in yield, going from 0 to just 15 pounds of P2O5 per acre. And what was surprising to us, this was at a very high soil test phosphorus level, a level which I would not advocate any phosphorus fertilizer. When we moved up to 30 pounds of P2O5 per acre, we increased yield to about 40. And then by the time we got up to 60 pounds, we essentially had our max yield, and adding any more did not help. A lot of Montana growers apply in the order of 15 to 25 pounds of P2O5 per acre. So they're probably getting some benefit that they might not have even realized. If they bump that up a little more, they might counteract this acidity to a degree. We think the mechanism for this is that phosphorus helps tie up aluminum both in the soil and actually in the roots, and that prevents aluminum from moving up to the foliage where it can have even bigger effects. Question would be, does this always work? And what the graph here on the right shows is that no, it doesn't. So when the pH was somewhat higher at another site, pH 4.8 compared to 4.4, notice that liming did not have as large of an effect over the control. Think of this big blue dot as the control, and phosphorus had essentially no benefit as well. So this isn't going to work in every case. You might want to try it out on your farm, maybe in a strip. And I would think the lower the pH that you start out with, probably the higher the potential for a benefit. So that's all I had on cultural. Basically, managing nitrogen, decreasing nitrogen rates if you can afford to do so, picking crop rotations that generally require less nitrogen, leaving more stubble on the surface, not haying as much, and then also considering adding phosphorus. When we run economics on that phosphorus, it's not going to pay off nearly as fast as adding lime. But for somebody, for example, who's leasing land, or somebody who doesn't have a spreader or a way to apply lime, most direct seeders have a way to add phosphorus. And so this would be an option to get you through a few years till you can figure out a liming practice.
Great. Thank you for that information, Clain. The graph that you showed with the different cropping systems was really telling, and from what I can see. Those were field peas, is that correct? Or just regular green?
Field peas, yeah.
Yeah. Do you suspect that the results would be similar with chickpeas or lentils, or that just a kind of legume and rotation?
Yeah, I think it's basically you're not applying any nitrogen in that year, and there's some literature that shows that pulse residue, lime and pea and chickpea residue, is actually higher in pH than cereal residue. So I think it's a double combo of saving on nitrogen and that residue bumping up the pH.
Okay, it looks, so there's been a lot of discussion in our area to lime by zones. And it does look like we have a question about phosphorus. This is the last question, and then we can work on audience questions.
Sounds good.
So yeah, in our area, there's been a lot of talk about liming by zones, I think in yours as well. Can you speak to that, and if that's a good idea, and if so, how do growers go about making zone maps?
Yeah, I think this figure answers that first part of that question. So this was drone imagery from a safflower field on a soil that had a pH of about 4.5. It shows that parts of the field are dark green and parts of the field have absolutely nothing growing on it. So with the high cost of lime, I think it's almost imperative that you not lime the entire field, that you only lime the areas that need it. And one method that at least one of our farmers with a low pH has done is actually just used Google Maps. He knew his land enough that he knew where the low yielding areas were due to something besides pH. So that might be a ridge top or some old boundary, some compacted soils, and then all of the other areas, he just made the assumption that if there was little growing, that area was likely low pH. And so he used a lime spreader and applied high rates of lime where there was essentially no growth. He applied kind of mid rates of lime where there was some growth, and then he applied no lime where the crop looked good. Again, from Google Earth, you could get higher resolution using something like drone imagery. But when you have a field that looks like this, I'm not sure you really need higher resolution. You basically need to get lime on these areas where there is no growth. So I think liming by zone is almost absolutely necessary, either using photos or grid sampling. And I think what you'll find is grid sampling is a lot more expensive than using either aerial imagery by drone or by satellite or by plane.
Do you guys ever use the field stick in your work, or the soil stick in field pH meter, or something similar?
Yeah, that's what our producers are using, is like a pH stick. We have, a higher end pH when we're measuring pH in the field, but I think those pH sticks seem to work pretty well. And I think it's a good way to get a flavor for what's happening out there. And you could use maybe a combination of measured soil pH and then aerial imagery to and work probably with a crop advisor to draw up a variable rate application map.
Great. Thanks, Clain.
No problem.
You got some really great information. You guys have really been doing a lot over there in Montana to address this problem as well, or this challenge. So it looks like we've got 2 questions about phosphorus. Would switching our phosphorus to rock phosphate instead of 10-34-0 and our S to gypsum instead of ammonium sulfate help to reverse or at least slow down soil acidification?
Yeah, those are 2 great points. So here, that listener might have noticed that we actually use triple superphosphate. This is a fertilizer that you essentially cannot find in bulk anymore, only in bag. At least I haven't been able to find it for producers. And so one advantage, of course, is that both monoammonium phosphate, which is 1152.0, 1034.0, which is, I believe, also monoammonium or diammonium phosphate type liquid product. That ammonium, the nitrogen in those products, acidifies at twice the rate of our typical nitrogen fertilizers. So for example, urea, anhydrous ammonia, ammonium nitrate, for each pound of nitrogen, there's essentially the acidity that's produced is about half of what you get from ammonium phosphate and ammonium sulfate. Certainly we don't apply a large amount of ammonium phosphate and ammonium sulfate compared to our, say, our urea or our UAN products. But when every little bit counts, I think it would be good to minimize ammonium phosphate and ammonium sulfate. So yes, I think gypsum is a great way to go. It's a little less soluble. That could be bad in the early part of the season, but it could be good later in the season. Rock phosphate is a little harder for me to answer because a lot of those products are not very available in phosphorus. So if you could find something that was, say, ground really finely, advertised a relatively large amount of available phosphorus, that might be a very good way to go.
My understanding is that gypsum can also help tie up some of the aluminum. It doesn't actually modify pH, but it can.
Yes, I don't think gypsum will bind up the aluminum, but what it will do is plants, if they have calcium and they have aluminum available to them, will take up more of the calcium and exclude the aluminum. So gypsum by itself, we have not studied this, but gypsum by itself could actually help with that, decrease that aluminum toxicity. So I think it would be something worthy to try.
So also Kate is asking, in your phosphorus studies was applied as triple superphosphate, and hence there is a calcium addition as well. Isn't it possible you saw a response to the calcium rather than sequestering aluminum?
Certainly, we cannot definitively say what the mechanism here is. There was a similar study done in Oklahoma, and that's what we based this one on. And I'd have to go back and look if they use triple superphosphate or not. My guess, though, is that this is such a dramatic effect. We know in Montana soils, we have a lot of calcium, even in these acidic soils, a lot of calcium. Exchangeable calcium rates or amounts in the 1,000 to 2,000 pounds. So the amount of calcium added here would actually be relatively low. And so, it's just a guess, but I really believe that it's likely the phosphorus. I did find an old study by a plant physiologist where phosphorus, I guess, has been used in the tropics for years for the same effect. And they mechanistically found that this phosphorus was tying up aluminum in the roots. So there is a mechanistic reason that phosphorus increased yield. It could be partly due to the increased calcium.
Another question coming in, would banding lime with the seed be worthwhile to spread out the cost over a number of years?
Yeah, we have producers who, of course, don't want to spend the large amounts that I'm talking about up front. And there are prilled lime products that could be banded near or with the seed. And what I've seen is one study in Washington State, you may be familiar with it, by Tabitha Brown. And what that study found was that 200 pounds of probe lime per acre, there was no increase in soil pH. So I think you'd have to apply fairly high levels, and I think you'd have to do it over time. And then the problem is at $200 per ton, I think you'd end up spending quite a bit more than you might, for example, on, say, sugar beet lime or ag lime. But because most people own a direct seeder, it's a great way to get lime into the soil. But I think you'd want to start it before you started seeing yield losses, meaning more of as a prevention. Say 300 or 400 pounds every year should be enough to offset the acidification from nitrogen, at least based on calculations we've done here.
Great.
I'll just kind of slowly go back through graphics, and maybe one will trigger someone to realize or remember that they maybe had a question on a certain study.
Okay, Matthew, if you are welcome to unmute and share your question.
Yes. Excuse me, Matthew Weaver with the Capital Press. If a farmer from our region were to come up to you and say, what's the most urgent thing that needs to be taken care of from your standpoint at this point, Clain?
I think I would say it's sampling. I mean, it's knowing how big of a problem this is. And so if I just dive right in with cultural practices or with liming before I really know the extent of the problem, I think the most urgent thing, if it hasn't been done already, is to know the depth of the low pH, to know whether or not tillage could work, and to also know the extent of it. Is it on, say, 5% of your field, or is it on 60% of your field? And if so, what are the yield losses due to that low pH?
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Matthew.
Can I add to that a little bit? So one of the resources that was developed through WSU Extension is actually was put together by Paul Carter and is available on the WSU Small Grains Soil and Water resource page. And it actually goes through how to soil sample for low pH in the field with a soil stick. So that's a pretty good resource to check out if people are interested in using that.
I think after some sort of, kind of say low resolution grid is done, let's say you just do 30 samples over a field, you could then overlay those locations with, say, a handheld low resolution recreational GPS unit. You could put those onto a Google Earth map and see if you see correlations between low plant growth and pH. And just, this is kind of low tech, high tech is how I view it. It's like a way you can, as a producer, do this yourself. See if there's a certain pH where it looks like there's less greenness, less cover, and that's probably the pH where you need to think about liming to above that pH. And so I think those two used in concert could be really effective.
I have a question. This is, I'm under Josie Littler. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can see you and hear you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My name's Bill Littler. That's my daughter, but anyway. So have you done research on the pH level for like a green pea?
We haven't done, say, a gradient of pH levels. I'm more relying on kind of visual where we start seeing poor nodulation, and some of that is just from the literature, but what I see in the literature is somewhere around pH 5.6 or 5.7 nodulation goes down, and somewhere by about pH 5 end fixation is completely stopped. And so the plant, the crop itself, seems actually fairly tolerant of low pH. And how we know that is we laid one of these studies, like the one you see in front of us, on a high nitrate location, and the crop looked really good, both limed and unlimed. But when we really run into problems is where we start with low nitrogen, then the lime makes a large difference, and we just simply don't get nitrogen fixation. We get very chlorotic plants, somewhere below, I'd say around 5.6 it starts, and below 5 there's simply no end fixation. So I would try to keep any sort of pulse field above pH 5.6 to 5.8 would kind of be my rule of thumb to make sure you have decent end fixation.
I concur with that. We have a field that was, I'm a farmer near the Troy area, which is kind of acidic soil to begin with. We had some 4.8 to 5.2, and we put 2 tons of hydrated lime on that, and it seemed to bring up my yields quite a bit.
Right.
Drastically, in fact, on that. Nice.
Yeah. And that's where I'm curious, maybe like a prilled lime might even work a little bit better because it's such a tight area where nodulation is occurring, you know, usually where you've put down near where you've put down your inoculant. And so maybe there would be some benefits of getting that seed row just a little higher in pH.
You know, Clain, while we're maybe waiting for people to think of another couple of questions, I have one that's been asked of me a few times, so I thought I would bounce it off of you. So what do you think about the addition of organic matter amendments? So whether that's compost or biosolids or some version of that, or even biochar, how have you looked at all into how that might impact pH in Montana?
We have not in our studies. One of our farmer collaborators, though, early on tried steer manure and could tell exactly where he applied the steer manure to, because I think the rationale there is steer manure, at least in Montana, has a pH generally somewhere around 8 or so. So I think it might have been a direct effect of just raising the pH enough to mitigate aluminum toxicity. Also, those organics in the manure will help complex some of that aluminum, and also the solids will help absorb some of the aluminum. So it's probably a 3-way mechanism, and this is only, you know, observational. I don't know rates. I don't know, you know, if other manures would work as well, but I think in general the concept is sound. Biochar, I could hypothesize. I think most of it's relatively high pH that you might see a benefit. I think the volumes that you would need, though, to see a benefit might be more cost prohibitive than, say, manure. Anything else?
So not all tons of lime are equal. Is that correct? Do you figure that from a lime score? You were just addressing sugar beet lime.
Right. So we had some of our studies were on pure lime and some were on sugar beet lime. But when you're determining liming rates, the sugar beet lime is somewhere around 50 to 70% calcium carbonate. A lot of that extra is moisture. And so, yeah, with sugar beet lime, you end up having to add more to have the same benefit as straight calcium carbonate. So that's an excellent point. Well, if you think of any other questions, you could email Carol and she can get those questions to me and I'll do my best to answer them. And I wish everybody the best of luck in this current environment, and also with any of your soil acidity issues you have.
Thank you so much, Clain. We really appreciate you joining us today.